Mm.
Yeah. So, hi guys. Welcome to our talk about libertarianism and if it is compatible with social doctrine. As our speaker is my fiance, Nathan Kreider, who has written in several magazines. One of them was Mises. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Some people
No.
pronounce it that way, so you're fine. Mises is the most popular, but I have heard my
Mises.
type of stuff.
The Austrian economic uh, magazine. I think that's the only one I remember. Austrian economic and one other magazine. And then being libertarian, and that's another one you also wrote. But he's written for a lot of like economic magazines. Recently, he's been moving to more Catholic thought. So he's written for Crises. He's written for the Catholic Exchange.
Catholic Exchange, they're both owned by Sophia, so they're both very similar, I think.
Yes, yeah. So how we're going to do this talk is that I will be asking Nathan questions so that it can be formatted. The questions are basic because I this is not really for advanced level. This is for basic, especially for people like me. Well, I don't really know much about economics. So to give us a grasp on what libertarianism is, what is the Austrian School of Economics, and if this is compatible with Catholic teaching. So my first question, Nathan, and the first topic is what is libertarianism? How is it different from conservatism?
Yeah, so it all depends. I think both of them, that both of them, Robert Nisbet calls them uneasy cousins. Um, and I think in a similar way, if you're familiar with conservatism, you might know there's like Anglo-American conservatism, which is different from European conservatism. And there's even within American conservatism, right? You have like the traditionalists, you have the like the new right, the neoconservative, like there's 28 different groups. So in that sense, it's like same thing with the libertarians. There's like 28 different groups. You can have like the Cato think tank people where their biggest thing is, this tax rate is currently 22%, let's make it 21%. And then you have a bunch of the more radical thinkers, right, who and then you have the everyone's most famous embarrassment, I guess you could say, is the Libertarian Party, right? And that's most people's probably common opinion of it is just like, yeah, there's people that are arguing about driving licenses and or driver's licenses and age of consent, and it's like, you know, it's just about getting different your definitions right, I guess. So to that extent, if someone says like something is not compatible with another thing, I want to say, you might entirely be right depending on a definition that is very common, right? So in that sense, it's like libertarianism, at least in America, grew out of the old right, which in America was a group that was responding to the progressive era back in the 1930s, 1940s. And the old right didn't really believe anything other than that there were a bunch of people with all different beliefs. Some were more left wing, some were like Southern agrarian conservatives, some were more traditional, some were incredible. Like some of the most famous ones were Catholic, I believe. But lots of them were like again different religions, different groups. They had very little in common beyond they figured the New Deal was bad. The progressive era is changing America. This is a bad thing. We're getting more involved overseas and foreign engagements, and this is all a bad thing. So in a sense, although none of them called themselves conservatives, they were all the beginning of the American right wing, kind of looking back and saying America's changing and it's becoming more progressive. We don't like that. We want to kind of preserve things the way they were, harken back to what made America great, and that's where you had the America First movement, the original America First movement. After the 1940s, after World War II, where they pretty much lost everything they advocated for, they didn't get. You had different branches that all tried to preserve their own little part of what the old right meant. And so you had one group, the conservatives. You had like the new conservatives, William F. Buckley. They became known as the neoconservatives later on as a pejorative, but that kind of took hold as mainstream American conservatism. And their whole idea was preserving the anti-communist aspect, right? We need to fight the communists overseas. Um, and our number one foe is the Soviet Union. You had the traditional conservatives like Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, Richard Weaver, who were preserving that more like that Burkean aspect of the old right that focused on we are concerned with order, and these progressives are just tearing up like all of the order of America, and we need to kind of recognize that emphasis on order and the importance of it, right? So you had a lot of them writing about the greatness of Edmund Burke, right? Russell Kirk was the one who kind of popularized the term America as not a pejorative, because in America it used to be a pejorative as, oh, you're a conservative, just like those British that were against us, right? So they were like they kind of Russell Kirk kind of sanitized the term and said, no, this is something that Americans can, we can have our own form of conservatism that really defends what it meant. And then lastly, you had the libertarians who were just focusing on, they weren't anti the other things. They were just focusing on the anti-state aspect of, okay, our national debt's ballooned. Everything the state's doing is infecting our lives compared to 50 to 100 years ago. So they kind of emphasized that part. And to an extent, they all kind of drifted away from each other, unfortunately. But I guess all that sum up is like if someone says libertarianism is hedonism, I can find many different definitions that disagree with that. But I won't deny that there are a lot of people who believe there are a lot of self-described libertarians who would definitely fit that, right? Do they, if you're ever curious, that Russell Kirk, after Hayek gave his famous "Why I'm Not a Conservative" speech, Russell Kirk went home and penned a very frustrated letter called "Libertarians Chirping Sectaries," denouncing them all as hedonists. And like he was very upset. It's very emotional, but it's also very entertaining because in his mind, right, if you're someone like a traditional, if you're a very socially conservative libertarian, he would say, "I'm not talking about you at all. But I am talking about these people, which there are very many of them." Right? So again, fair enough. I don't want to say someone's like completely wrong to say, well, you have your definition wrong. If you want to say they're all hedonists, I think that's overstating it. And I have many books to say they're not all hedonists, but many of them are. So again, I won't doubt that. But then you had more, again, you had more libertarians who were their main focus was just we are anti-state. Which, when you look at someone like Eric von Kuhnert-Lejeune, who is not very well known at all, he's definitely not a big representative, but he was a monarchist. He was like an actual Austrian aristocrat, right? And he was very much involved in like the American libertarian
Um,
movements. He had people like
uh,
that, and then of course you have
Nathan.
like the paleo libertarians, the last group, like the paleo libertarians, who are kind of like, no, the conservatives got it right. We need the conservatism part of it. If you don't have that, it's just hedonism. So they kind of had that extra emphasis on like you need all of these things. But
Nathan, just to simplify it a bit, so what would you say unifies, you mentioned that there are many different kinds of libertarian thought. So what is the unifying factor that would say like, okay, even if our thoughts are different, we are still libertarian? And what is the unifying factor with conservatives that would say, okay, we are conservative? Even if like we disagree on fundamental things, there's something uniting them that would put them as a conservative and something uniting libertarians that would put them as a libertarian.
right, yeah, and that is a good point too. I made things overcomplicated and now to resimplify it. Because I guess it's very unnuanced and it's very like I don't think it's good to go too far with this, but in a vague sense, you can say like the conservatives were concerned with order and the libertarians were concerned with liberty in whatever way you could mean those terms, right? So like American conservatism has that long tradition of ordered liberty, um, of sort of like recognizing that you do need a combination of both and they can kind of support one another. But to that extent, you'll have lots of libertarians who would say we are, we are libertarian because we are for liberty, right? We are for freedom, and without freedom, you get things like the Soviet Union. You get things that can hardly be called ordered at all. You get things that like a big case they would point out is like the Middle Ages, and they would say the Middle Ages compared to today are very free in a certain sense. Very free in terms of the state barely got involved at all, and look how ordered that society was. So they would emphasize that they both work together. Whereas you would have plenty of other libertarians who are like, no, I just care about liberty. I just care about being able to do what I want in my own house. Like, I don't care about any of that stuff. And to that extent, I would disagree with them, right? I would say that's you're missing so much, but like technically they would fit the definition. In the same way, conservatives are all about order, but the difference between like a Russell Kirk versus a Wilmore Kendall, like a Russell Kirk would find a lot in common with a lot of the more traditional like libertarian types. They were very close to each other. They just use different terms. But to the extent of like a James Burnham, well, as much as I do like James Burnham, he was not like a Russell Kirk type conservative at all. He was for order, but his order was much more about we need to build a big empire so that we can crush the communists. Right?
Could I ask a
And
question?
yes, go on.
Um, for example, I could imagine that perhaps a conservative could argue against democracy, where, yes, for a libertarian, that's impossible. That would go against any idea of individual liberty. Would that
Yeah,
be a
I would push.
reasonable,
Or go ahead.
if there would be a reasonable like difference between the two?
Yeah. I would push back a little bit, and I only say a little bit in terms of I think you're broadly true. Although I wouldn't say it's impossible because like Eric von Kuhnert is the one I think of where he's a pretty hardcore libertarian, but at the same time he actually I'm looking at it right now, but I want to go up and get it. There's a book he wrote called Liberty or Equality. And the entire like the first, 3 or 4 chapters are just here is the entire libertarian tradition and like more of their ancestors, the people before that was a term back in the 18th, 17th centuries. Here are all these people in like the classical liberal tradition that are very hardcore for liberty, just talking about how evil and terrible democracy is. So, and it's something like, I think broadly what you said is true. And to, like the libertarians are pro-democracy, the classical liberals were pro-democracy. But that is an interesting book to say. Actually, there were a significant number that warned about like the evils of democracy, mainly because a lot of it is sort of like a methodological thing of if democracy and representative government brings people freedom, then great, we want it. But if it doesn't bring people freedom, like Alexis de Tocqueville warned about, right? He's like, well, then you're against it, right? Because if you think it can actually lead to more tyrannical, um, like a more tyrannical state, meaning like the bureaucracy kind of grows out of control, then you would be against it. So, but yeah.
Okay,
So,
Tyler, sorry.
Sorry.
Still read the comments. Go ahead.
In essence, the libertarians are very much focused on individual liberty, like, not, yeah, just individual liberty, and like their end game is freedom for freedom in yes. Their end game is freedom for all, while conservatives are their end game is towards an ordered society.
Yeah, I think that that's largely true in the sense of, again, you can find libertarians who would say, I am for liberty, because you can find like a Lord Acton, right, who would say, liberty is the highest political good. But he was a very firm Catholic. So he wouldn't say liberty is the highest good, period. He would say, like, in the political realm, the highest role is liberty. But he would always ground that in the purpose of liberty being so important was for an ordered, virtuous society. So you kind of have people that are kind of halfway in between like that. That kind of get, and of course you would have people at the same time that are more conservative that would say, I love, like, I want an ordered society, and that ordered society is a free society. That's where it's like, I think, pretty much what you said is correct. There's just that sense of which I think a lot of people significantly overlap, and a lot of the times it's just terminology. And there, of course, again, not to emphasize also that there are people in the complete fringes where, like, you can be a conservative and have nothing in common with the libertarian, and vice versa. You can be like a complete hedonist and just say, the reason I love individual liberty, the reason I prioritize individual liberty is because I want to be able to play video games all day, right? Or just do like whatever I want without any social consequences. And that's like more of like a John Stuart Mill type, right? Where I'll admit I might have gotten him wrong. I haven't read much Mill, but from what the impression I get is like Mill's much more on that like more left wing side of it, where I'd say the only libertarians I've read are very critical of Mill, but there are lots of libertarians that like Mill, so you could end up on either side of that too.
We will take one more question before we move to the next topic, if there still is any other question. Okay, so we'll just move on to the next one. So the next one is, how does libertarianism differ from other schools of economic thought? For example, Marxism, distributism, or you can also talk about this. He was talking to me yesterday about distributism. This I remember now. So
I saw before I forgot, I saw a comment that said, or I see a comment that says Mill was surprisingly socialist. Again, I don't know very much about Mill, but I have read that I guess a lot of times his wife wrote under his name, and he allowed that. He was like, yeah, he wants to give his wife an opportunity to write, and she was apparently a lot more socialist than he was, and she might have influenced him in that direction. I don't know how, I believe that's true, but I'm not 100% positive on that. But when it comes to onto the second question, then like libertarian it's a political thought, not an economic thought. So there is in a sense where like you can be a Chicago school, you can be Austrian school, or like I heard someone talk about, and I think this is definitely true. There do seem to be people that are not really interested in economics at all. They're just interested in liberty. Like the more left-wing libertarians, the people in the Libertarian Party, they're like, I love liberty. And when it comes to economics, they're like, yeah, I guess I'll learn that to make my case. But beyond that, I don't care. And I've noticed, like, people have pointed out, those people tend to be very, like, hedonistic, I guess. Like their goal is the hedonism part, or they're again, or the libertine part, where they are much more like, I am that because I want liberty, period, end of story. Like I'm focused on the ability for me to do what I want. And then there is a sense in where you take the Chicago school and again, I'm Austrian school. The Austrian school, it almost seems to be like, if the Austrian school were wrong or the Chicago school were wrong, then it's like, well, you wouldn't want to be a libertarian. You want to be a conservative instead. Because those schools where, even though they have their differences, they're broadly general. And there's the public school choice, or the public choice school as well. Like they're much smaller, but they're what as well. Their whole emphasis being like, well, if I have a certain framework of the world, if I understand the world in a way that if the state gets involved in something, even if it means well, it's going to do damage. If that is my understanding of economics, is that like I'm very oversimplifying, but if your understanding of the world is when bureaucracies get involved in things, and there does tend to be a negative to that, then I would be for liberty in a more conservative sense of like, why would I want a bunch of bureaucrats steamrolling like my natural society, basically my very socially conservative society? I don't want that. And so when it comes to like where's the like the Austrians and the Chicago school compared to other schools of thought, a lot of it's methodology. A lot of it is you can take their theory of value. Um, and like where their theory to value differences, because of like Marx preferred a more like labor theory of value, right, which then got kind of qualified later. The Austrians have their subjective theory of value. There's also like the cost of production theory of value, and these like underlying assumptions kind of help you start building things up because Marxism's I don't want to say built on, but like one of its foundations is the labor theory of value, right? And if you throw out the labor theory of value, if that ends up being wrong, then a lot of Marxism kind of faces some serious problems, right? Because they're assuming that's true. They're assuming that a lot of these things coming from there is based on the labor theory of value being true. So when it comes to like subjective theory of value, these like again, the Austrians are the subjective school. I think that's largely been accepted as true with certain conditions. That's the one that the scholastics really accelerated. Like this was pretty much unheard of until the late Middle Ages. There were definitely like the scholastics would credit Aristotle as providing the foundations for the subjective theory of value. But I believe it's like in more literature, it's called like Aristotle's is called the utility theory of value, in which something's valued because it has a use to human being. St. Augustine talks about this in his City of God, of all things. And then they took that and they kind of developed it further into essentially saying the value of something is determined by basically its the perceived ability of a human being to value it. Like if I see something is valuable to me, I will want it. And it's not because there's any kind of intrinsic value baked into the object, even though again, theologically, St. Augustine would say there is an intrinsic value of something that's locked in, but in a second sense, there's a more economic value of I only want something because I value it. If I buy a book, that indicates that I want it because I will receive some kind of utility or value from owning that book. The big thing being I can read it. Now, if I value a certain book, a specific book we're thinking of, why don't I buy a second copy of that exact same book? Well, because the first copy allows me to read the book. The second copy doesn't really do anything for me because like I could always read it with the first copy. What do I need a second copy for? So there's that sense of like, well, the second copy is not valuable to me unless I wish to resell it, in which case maybe I'll buy 10 copies if I own a bookstore, right? That's why I would buy multiple copies because then I plan to sell them again. So there's that
Maybe
additional
there's a
use there for
question.
me. Mhm.
Good evening. I would just like to ask, maybe I'll have some more specific questions along the way. I'm just curious because you've mentioned, and I'm not sure if I will identify. Of course, I don't identify like how transgender identify. I mean, I'm not sure if I would say I'm a libertarian before these 2020s, prior to pandemic. But at the very least, I was inclined, or I am a bit familiar with Catholic libertarians, especially for philosophical reasons, because that's my entry point to libertarianism. So when you've said, for example, that earlier, like generally, if the state is more involved in things, that something bad will probably happen. I'm just rewording it. I'm wondering, like, are you stating it from a more economical perspective? Like, economically, a libertarian model is better than others? Or are you saying that it's more from a philosophical perspective that, in principle, state cannot, it's like it's morally wrong for the state to be more involved in other things? So, are you stating from an economic perspective or from a philosophical perspective? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question because like what I'm stating, like if I'm stating just kind of not taking myself out of it and just giving like a basic definition, there are certainly people in both camps where they would say I'm a libertarian because that is the moral thing. The state is immoral for the state to intervene in my life in a way that is like the whole non-aggression principle thing, right? And to an extent that's a very popular, that's probably the most popular, like common understanding of it. So fair enough, that's a big definition. They would say there is a moral opposition to the state being like, well, I can just take control of your life now. And they would say, okay, well, I think we would all agree that like the Soviet Union went way overboard, and the libertarians would say it's like, okay, well, if we say the Soviet Union's not went overboard, but so is every other government. They're going overboard too. Everyone on planet Earth, like they're all going overboard. That's kind of the more philosophical approach to it. I personally come from the more economic approach, especially when it comes to integrating with like the Catholic thought, because I already have the Catholic thought when it comes to the philosophy part of it. So for me, the economic part of it is kind of the reason where I think there's value there, because the economic part would say if you get a bunch of really traditional Catholics who really don't understand like economics or the way society functions, you can do a lot, or they can do a lot of damage by saying we're going to pass a program to protect the family. It's like, well, you might actually, if you don't know how to protect the family, you might actually do a lot of damage. Meaning, certain policies tend to have negative consequences that you're not even aware of at the time. And they would say that the more economic perspective is if you're a Catholic and you want a traditional Catholic society, or even if you're just more of a general conservative, you want conservative social values, they would say those tend to thrive in a place where the family is strong, the family is autonomous, people work together, there's social interaction, there's a high trust society, and it tends to be weaker when the state starts getting involved in things, even if it means well, because you have all these unintended consequences and ramifications. A case being like a social safety net, they would say, if you think a social safety net is worth the consequences, then fine. But to an extent, you can say, well, in a society without a government-run social safety net, there are typically all kinds of private services that pop up. There's the big thing being the church. The church often provided direct social care. If you were someone who was really, really in trouble, you would go to your church, and the church would say, hey, we can help you. And that way you have a priest working with you one-on-one, or you've got different social services helping you one-on-one. And if you're someone who is, let's say, not really responding to those in a way that like you're not kind of getting back on your feet, you're just taking advantage of that system, they're more likely to cut you off and say, look, I can see you. You're not taking you're kind of taking advantage of this. Whereas from a state system, it's like you have a state social safety net. At least in a lot of countries, it ends up being you're just a number on a screen. They start sending you money. There's all this fraud. There's all this case of, are they actually checking to see if you are taking advantage of this? Is this a process? Even if you are, um, entirely like a virtuous person trying to get back on your feet, oftentimes there's a lot of disincentives to get off of it because, okay, well, you got a job, you're no longer eligible, or you met this criteria, you've finally gotten back on your feet enough that you're no longer eligible, so we're going to cut you off completely. I'm just throwing out a few ideas, and to a certain extent, you might say, fair enough, like I think it's worth it. I think the social safety net with all its flaws is worth, like that's having a social safety net. But the economic emphasis would be on there's a lot of negative consequences, not just in terms of wasted money, but in terms of social and cultural consequences to this too. Meaning, if you are saying to someone, I'm going to give you money, no questions asked, for essentially either A, failing in life, or two, just falling on hard times and it's not your fault at all, there is a sense in which it encourages that behavior. So that would be the economic emphasis in sense of like there's a trade-off there. That's not to say you should never do it, but it is to say make sure you're aware of the negative consequences that come from this, which might be surprisingly extreme in some cases, depending on how you on exactly how it turns out. The big thing being that there's a lot of books. Charles Murray is the one who wrote probably the most famous book on it. There's one called Losing Ground that just goes through like American social policy from I think it's 1960 to 1980, and he attributes that a lot of the decline in culture, the sexual revolution, a lot of the decline of the black family, he attributes it very largely to the welfare state. Maybe not all welfare states every time, but at least the way America did it is we were trying to help the poor, and we ended up just completely disincentivizing any kind of strong cultural foundation. We ended up encouraging a lot of terrible behavior and rewarding it by like allowing that kind of lifestyle. And to give one final quick example of just something where I could see it both sides, but the case would be in terms of if a woman wants to get divorced, can the state step in and provide her a social safety net, some kind of grounding? If the state does, that encourages divorce, just because if it's easier to get divorced, then more people are going to get divorced. But you could also argue on the other side, it's like, well, yeah, it's easy to get more divorce, but that means if you're being abused by your husband, that gives you an easier way out. So you can make the case of like, yeah, it's worth it for me. But the emphasis would still be you are encouraging something that overall we think is bad, which is divorce, right?
I'm just going to end this meeting only because this is a free I mean, it's free, so I have like 1 minute before this ends, and I'll make a new link again. So I'll end it and then save, and
We
then
need to
start again.
voluntarily donate in the name of libertarianism so that you can have premium Zoom next time.
Okay, if anyone has a premium, use it so I don't have to do it. I'll post it.